We'll start with social innovation. Now, in my opinion, this is the difficult one. I'll use some examples here to help you get your head around how difficult. So, this is the iconic Mini Cooper. It's actually from the late 1950s, and if you don't know terribly much about cars, you might not realize that the Mini was one of the highest technology devices on the planet when it was first launched. There are so many innovations in this car, and the innovations are primarily so that Minis, although they're very small on the outside, they feel big on the inside. The wheels are at right pushed out to each corner. It had a transverse mounted engine, it's front wheel drive. There were a number of other innovations in it to make the cabin space as big as possible. And it actually became a cultural meme that minis are bigger than they seem. And back in the 1970s and the 1980s, in the United Kingdom, it was very popular to have jokes like, how do you put 4 elephants in a mini? And competitions like, how many students can you fit into a mini? How many gymnasts can you put in a mini? And how many Boy Scouts can you fit into a mini, and so on. And actually, you could look up the world record for this, but it's something like 21 people. How do you squeeze 21 human beings in there? I have no idea. But the Mini's very iconically British, very innovative, post-war thing. And of course, the modern version of the Mini's a lot bigger. And by modern standards, it's not particularly innovative. It's fun still. So the Mini's really become iconic. This is Mary Quant, the fashion designer who invented the miniskirt. Now, the miniskirt's largely associated with the women's liberation movement, and often people think women's liberation came about because of the contraceptive pill. They're allowing them to take control of when they have babies and therefore control of their careers, allowing them to work more. But actually, perhaps the biggest thing in women's liberation was the humble washing machine. Because prior to that, and still throughout the world, very poor, in poor parts of the world, women spend an inordinate amount of their time doing laundry. So you create the washing machine, you free up women's time, you give them the contraceptive pill so that they're not having babies when they'd prefer not to, and now they have control of their career, and they're going to signal all that liberation by wearing the miniskirt. So 1960s, Mary Quant inventing the miniskirt. Now, forward to 1970s, so this is late 1950s, early 1960s, and now we're in the mid-1970s, although these pictures are much more recent. This is Vivienne Westwood, the fashion designer who invented punk. And this is Malcolm McLaren, the music producer who invented punk music. So punk happened in London in the United Kingdom in the mid-1970s, and here's the news for all the Green Day fans. Punk was over by 1978. At that point, it was all post-punk. All the great 80s bands are actually from the late 1970s, and they're post-punk bands. So London was this place, although technically the Mini's from Coventry, which isn't London. So the United Kingdom and London were this place where you got all this tremendous innovation, and yet if you ask people to describe what they would think of British culture, it's naturally thought of as quite conservative, that it's a constitutional monarchy, that the concept of the United Kingdom's been around for a few hundred years. The concept of England and the current lineage of the monarchy has been around for about 1,000 years. And we think of Britain as quite a conservative place, all these stockbrokers in the city of London all wearing their pinstripe suits with their dark-coloured shoes. And they get sent home. If they come to work in a pair of brown shoes, they get sent home. Now, no one forces them to wear the pinstripe suits, But they do. It's like the uniform. It's the social norm. It's conformance to the expectations. So in many ways, we think of the United Kingdom as conservative and therefore boring and slow-moving. But you look back over the last 50, 60 years since the Second World War, and a tremendous amount of cultural innovation came out of the United Kingdom, and specifically London. So, how do you go about creating a culture that can generate this level of innovation? Nowadays, in our world, we hear a lot about innovation. Companies want to be more innovative. They want to be able to reinvent themselves. And they think that somehow they do that by adopting some process like design thinking, or maybe lean startup, or who knows, upstream Kanban, discovery Kanban, customer Kanban, whatever the heck Patrick is calling it this season. So I personally consider myself quite an innovative guy. In the 1980s, I was a pioneer in the computer games industry. I have a photograph of me with a British government minister from the 1990s. I was receiving an award for innovation at a startup company I was working at the time in the 1990s. There are, I think, 16 patents filed in my name during the time when I worked at Sprint. We're currently filing a few more patents as part of some of the work we're doing with the Movius Group. And of course, I'm associated with Kanban and enterprise services planning and the fit for purpose framework and service-oriented organizations, organizational design, a service-oriented fashion, the Kanban maturity model, and so on and so on. I've spent my entire adult life, in fact, even from when I was quite a young teenager, 12, 13, 14 years old, being very innovative. And here's the scoop. You don't get to be that innovative by following a process. There's no design thinking that made me this innovative. That fundamentally, the innovation, of course, some of it comes from inside. It requires leadership. It requires risk-taking. But I am a product of the United Kingdom that produced the mini and the miniskirt and punk. Right? I grew up in that culture. I grew up in that education system. I grew up with this belief that it was okay to be a little bit of a rebel and do things differently, take some risks, and that risk-taking wasn't going to get me, for example, thrown in jail, because we had some fundamental freedoms in the United Kingdom, freedom of expression, freedom of speech, and so on. And we had a significant amount of trust in our society that those freedoms were actually properly protected. So I believe innovation comes from culture. It doesn't come from following some process. The Peter Drucker thing of culture eats strategy for breakfast. Yes, you could have a strategy, you want to be more innovative. You could have a strategy to adopt design thinking. But I don't actually think that's going to make you more innovative. It's the culture that makes you innovative. So here's the coaching question. How would you hack a culture so that emergent outcomes are of the same caliber as the miniskirt, punk fashion, and punk music? Punk fashion, punk music, yes, they went together, but they're actually not the same thing. They're two separate things. Now, moving away from socially innovative, liberal culture, the opposite end of the spectrum, conservative. Now, some of you are familiar with the fact I use the Happy Feet movie in the coaching masterclass. And the penguins of Happy Feet, they're pretty conservative. They, listening closely to the accents that they have, the expressions they use, effectively the dialect of English, the penguins seem to be modeled on the population of the Outer Hebridean Islands off the west coast of Scotland in the middle of the Atlantic. And that culture is very conservative. Their religion is what's called Free Presbyterian. And the history there is that we have the Presbyterian Church of Scotland, the Calvinist, Lutheran, Presbyterian. Presbytery refers to a system of government, an organizational structure, like a local municipality. That's a presbytery. And then the presbytery sends representatives to the annual parliament, and there's no concept of bishops or there's no equivalent of a pope in a Presbyterian church. There's just an elected moderator, like the Speaker of the Parliament, for 1 year term, sometimes 2 years, and then you get a new one, and the Parliament's held for a few days once a year. The Dutch Reformed Church in the Netherlands, also a Presbyterian church, same system, different name. So some period of time into after the Reformation, there were members of the Presbyterian church who felt that the church had become too liberal, that it was changing its ways, that society was moving too quickly, and they broke away from the original Presbyterian church and they formed what they called the Free Church of Scotland. And about 100 years went by, and some people in the Free Church of Scotland, they believed it had become too liberal and that society was moving too quickly and they didn't like it and they felt the church should be slowing things down. So they broke away and they formed the Free Presbyterian Church of Scotland. And that population live in the Hebridean Islands in the Atlantic. They're native Gaelic speakers. Also, Donald Trump's mother is one of these people. Right? Donald Trump's mother was from the island of Lewis. She was a native Hebridean, almost certainly native Gaelic speaker when she was younger, and Free Presbyterian. Now, to give you a concept of how conservative Free Presbyterians are, they have two different cemeteries at their church. They have the cemetery for the people who are going to heaven, and they have a separate cemetery for the people who are going to hell. And when somebody dies, someone in the local presbytery, perhaps one of the clergy, one of the ministers, passes judgment on that person's life and decides which cemetery they'll be buried in, the going to heaven cemetery or the going to hell cemetery. So the penguins and happy feet, they sound like and they behave like, and arguably they look like, because they're all in black and white, they're very conservatively dressed. The Hebridean population. And consequently, they're suffering some stress. The fish are not coming. So what do? They huddle closer together and they sing louder to their god, the great Gwyn. And they hope that if they're sufficiently pious, then God will be bountiful and will reward them, and that the fish will come back. It's very conservative, superstitious behavior. And the story of the Greenland Norse, which is told in Jared Diamond's book Collapse, has a very similar ring to it. The Greenland Norse were founded by Eric the Red, who was Icelandic, and he was a bad guy. He was put on trial, he was found guilty, and he was sentenced to death. But they gave him two options on how he would like to die. He could be executed the next day, or he could volunteer to take a longboat along with some of his followers, and he had to guarantee that he would sail the longboat off to the west. And in the 9th century, the belief was that the world was flat, and that if you reached the edge of the world, you fell off into the abyss. And therefore, Eric the Red was being condemned to fall off into the abyss, and from a Christian perspective, he was being condemned to purgatory, neither heaven nor hell, for eternity. And this was considered like the worst possible death, that your soul trapped in purgatory forever. Now, Eric the Red decided to take his chances on this purgatory thing. So he took the longboat and he sailed off to the west. And of course, he didn't fall off the end of the world as was predicted. Instead, he discovered Greenland. And actually, it wasn't called anything because he discovered it. And he was a good marketing guy. He decided that he would brand it in a way that would be attractive. Hence, it's Greenland. It's not rocky land. It's not Iceland. Incidentally, for Icelandic people, Iceland translates just as island. They are the island people. It's a rocky island. It's not an icy island. That's just the way it translated into English. So Eric the Red discovers Greenland. Now, this happened in the 9th century during a period in the history of the world that's known as the Roman warm period. Yes, we had global warming back then. And consequently, during this period of rule from Rome and Roman legions and so on, this also explains some anomalies. I would see in books when I was a kid growing up stories of the Romans in Britain, and particularly in the north of Britain and Scotland. Now, they didn't get on too well with the native people at the time who were known as the Picts, so they had to build a wall to keep the Picts out. And actually, there's two of those, right? There's Hadrian's Wall, and a bit further north, another one called the Antonine Wall. So if you're a Game of Thrones fan, you know where that came from, right? The Romans built the walls to keep the Scottish out. So we would see these pictures of the Roman legions from those time, sketches. Presumably they found, archaeological record. They found some of the clothing that people wear, maybe even some drawings from the time. And the Romans are wearing their little sort of mini skirt tunics and their open-toed sandals. And we would look at this and think, my God, they were tough back then. They didn't feel the cold at all, did they? They were hardy. But actually, no, that wasn't true. We had global warming, and Scotland was much warmer than it is today. So the Romans were just dressed appropriately for the weather. And Greenland at the time was green. So consequently, when they landed, they were able to settle down, and they spent one winter there, and then the next year they went back. Bit of a ballsy move. Went back to Iceland and said, "We have found a magical green land. God saved me so that I could discover this magical green land and come back and tell you all about it. It's much better than the rocky volcanic island you're living on, and you should all come with me to the magical green land." Fantastic branding. 7 boatloads of them did, and they formed the Greenland Norse population, and they thrived. About 100 years later, they petitioned the Pope for a bishop. Now you can imagine some member of the clergy at the Vatican. He's been studious, he's been showing that he's pious, and he gets the call to come and kiss the ring. It's the biggest day of his life. He goes to visit the Pope, and the Pope says to him, "Henceforth, I am promoting you to be Bishop of Greenland." He's like, "Where?" The modern day equivalent would be Bishop of Mars, maybe Bishop of Jupiter. So he's Bishop of Greenland. So off he goes, and he does what bishops do. He arrives there and says, "All right, we have to build a cathedral." And then they build the cathedral, and then they build some, adjacent monastery, and they populate it with some monks. And the reason we know all of this is the monks wrote it down. And when the Danes rediscovered Greenland 500 years later, they found all the records, and it's all written in Norse, and people still know how to read ancient Norse, so we know the stories. So the Greenland Norse, they are European. They are what we would now call Scandinavian. They're Norse. They speak the Norse language. They worship the old gods and the new God. Right? Game of Thrones again. So they have the old gods, the Norse gods. By the way, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, they're all Norse gods. Right? So they worship the old gods and the new God. They spoke Norse, they're European, they're white, and they're Christian Roman Catholic. There hadn't been the Reformation at that point in time, so it's relatively simple. You were either Orthodox or you were Catholic. And in this part of the world, they were Catholics. So, very good. And some time goes by, and the Roman warm period starts to come to an end. Gradually, the world cools down. We have global cooling during the 10th, 11th, 12th centuries. And gradually, the ice flows come south. And the natives who are living in those ice floes, the Inuit, they gradually come south and they start fighting the Greenland Norse. They fight them annually over the right to club the seals, because clubbing baby seals, that's how they survived at the time. So the Inuit were thriving in the cold conditions. And gradually the Norse were suffering, their European farming methods were suffering, their animals were suffering, they couldn't grow enough crops to feed the animals, and the population began to decline. And throughout all of this decline period, they did not copy anything that the Inuit did. The Inuit made canoes out of skin, animal skins, they paddled those canoes, they caught fish, they wore fur coats made out of skins. The Greenland Norse didn't copy any of this behavior. And the reason for it was that the Inuit, they weren't white, they didn't speak Norse, they weren't Christian. Fundamentally, the Greenland Norse believed the Inuit were animals. They weren't human in the opinion of the Greenland Norse. And therefore, they were unwilling to lower their standards to behave like animals. They fundamentally believed that their God would look after them. So you can imagine them towards the end, as the weather's getting colder, the summers are getting shorter, they're running out of food, their animals are starving, they're beginning to get hungry, and they huddle together in their cathedral and they sing louder to their God, and they pray harder, and they pray for better weather, longer summers, and bountiful harvests. And it didn't happen. And there were essentially 2 cold years where there was insufficient food grown, all the animals died, and then all the Greenland Norse died. The entire population was wiped out over 2 winters and gone. It was 500 years later before Denmark rediscovered Greenland, and it became a protectorate, part of Denmark. It came up recently because Donald Trump thought he would buy it, and the Danish were like, "You're kidding, right?" So the Greenland Norse, they died because they're conservative. And this story was the epiphany for me that you drive change through social innovation. You're either liberal or you're conservative. And conservative societies, conservative cultures, conservative organizations, they were the ones that were resisting adoption of agile. While agile methods presumed a high trust environment, a high social capital environment, the reality was that we could predict adoption of agile methods based on how liberal or conservative a particular culture was. So, it's hard to make change in conservative societies.